Okay, we're going to take a look at Jim Holt's article, MathMurders. As you can see, was published here in 2006. So what used to be not that long ago for me is turning into a long time ago, as we're up to over 14 years. But I want to run through the article with you and kind of explain what your assignment is going to be with this. Purposely kind of match this article up, MathMurders with Slaughterhouse 5, because we're taking a look at the idea of trying to quantify death with a tragedy, a man-made tragedy that takes place, and obviously with the bombing of Dresden from World War II in 1945, Vonnegut's certainly taking a look at a tragedy. And while he might not be trying to kind of quantify the deaths that took place, it's certainly something significant for him that he is trying to relieve from himself. So we have the article here, MathMurders, and so you have a copy of this, which I have opened up in Notability, and I think that probably would make the most sense for you folks as well. While you're not required to annotate the article, because we're going to be running through it together, you will see that as you get towards the last 2 pages, there is an article analysis assignment, an argument analysis assignment that goes through it. And we can kind of run through this now so that you can see what's going on and kind of pay attention to these things as we are reading through the article. So the first one, where it says to number all of the paragraphs, 1, 2, 3, and etc., that's already taken care of for you because I went ahead and did that. So that part is done. What you will do, and there's not necessarily a specific set way that I'm looking for you to do this, is I do want you then to chunk the paragraphs into 4 parts. So kind of break down not the essay, but the article into, an introduction, an opening, obviously kind of have a closing, and then what would be 2 main elements to the argument, 2 main parts of the argument. So when it comes to chunking your essay, 1, make sure that you do a chronological order as stated here, but then kind of come up with how you think the essay should be broken up. So an example would be you might decide that 1 and 2 is going to be one part, and then paragraphs 3 through 5, and then you're going to take a look at maybe 6 and 7 being another part, and then paragraphs 8 and 9 being a fourth. Now, I totally just came up with this arbitrarily, so don't read too much into it, but I want you to kind of come up with, 4 different sections to the article that you would use for organizational purposes, sort of, as to how he sets it up. Once you come up with those 4 parts, then what are going to be like a rhetorical purpose for each element, for each section? So you're going to have a rhetorical purpose sentence. So down here below where we can kind of see section 1, I'd be identifying what are my numbers that I'm going to be using for this section, and then that rhetorical purpose sentence is going to go in here. So what is the purpose? What is he trying to achieve? So kind of think of, as if you were doing a thesis statement for rhetorical analysis. What is he trying to achieve? Not within the essay or the article as a whole, but just within that section. And then down below, you can see that you're going to identify what are those persuasive strategies that he is using, and mentioned here certainly that there are going to be examples. Now, if you want to put this into bullet point form, that's perfectly fine. So you would be identifying, what is an overall strategy, what is a technique, what is something that he is using to help convey his point, and then let us know what it is. So identify what the strategy is, and then give a specific example so that we know precisely, or at least I know precisely, which part you are taking a look at. Doesn't mean it has to be a direct quotation, but there could be, for an example, you might decide that one of the things that he uses at some point is going to be statistics. And then you would list what those statistics are, and you want to make sure that the example that you use is going to be matching up with that overall rhetorical purpose that you identified for that section. So you're going to do that for each of the 4 sections that you come up with, all right? So more of you kind of justifying the chunk of your paragraphs as opposed to me going correct, incorrect with the automatic chunks that you include. And then give an overall summary of the argument. So looking at the passage as a whole, what is it that he is trying to articulate? So whereas before you were focusing on specific sections, this one is going to be looking at the passage as a whole. So what are the implications that he's looking to make? What is the overall argument? What's the complexity? So you're kind of paying attention to the nuances, the sophistication, so to speak, if we're looking at this from an AP exam standpoint. But give a summary of what that overall argument would be, kind of like a thesis statement, so to speak. Notice that you are going to be doing a 2-sentence summary that accurately reflects that complexity. You do not need to identify all of the individual rhetorical devices or techniques that he was using. So if you had statistics and then ethos and personification in one paragraph and then more techniques in another, I do not need you to list all of those individually. All right? So while we're running through the article, you can certainly kind of take note of what some of those devices, arguments, where those sections would be that maybe you want to take a look at, and go from there. Some of you might decide that, and again, just for example, paragraphs 1 and 2 make up one section, perfectly acceptable. Some of you might just identify that paragraph 1 on its own makes up a section, and then paragraph 2 matches up with 3 and 4, and so on and so forth. All right, so again, MathMurders, Jim Holt. Counting the dead is a paradoxical business. Suppose that I told you that around 150 million people have died over the last century in wars, genocides, and man-made famines and other atrocities. This number might invoke in you a certain horror, but it is, of course, only a wild guess. Its very vagueness lends it an air of unreality, yet what purpose would be served by making it more precise? Where mass death is concerned, the moral significance of scale seems to be one of those things that our brains aren't equipped to handle. A single life may have infinite value, but the difference between 1,000,000 deaths and 1,000,001 strikes us as negligible. A couple things from this opening paragraph. Certainly the number 150 million people over the last century, and again, this would be basically the 20th century, 1900 to 1999. If you were coming up with that number of 150 million deaths, I think we would certainly agree that that is a lot of people. And you consider, on a global scale, the atrocities that have gone on, and I think we kind of tend to think of things, rather ethnocentrically when it comes to, our own country. But you would be dealing with things such as World War I, obviously World War II. We would have the Korean War. Also have the Vietnam War, which is happening while Vonnegut is writing Slaughterhouse-Five, detailing what's happening with World War II. And certainly you have other conflicts globally that are taking on within the U.S. and many other nations. I think a lot of people, if you were to say 150 million, I'm thinking many of us would probably argue that that number is very well, most likely higher, beyond 150 million. And we don't have a total count, as far as I know, of anywhere within the 20th century. But unfortunately, I think a lot of us would probably go a little bit higher than 150 million. I have no idea what that real number would be, whether it's 200 million, 250, or if it's in fact 150 or lower. And then another thing here at the end of the paragraph, a single life may have infinite value, but the difference between 1,000,000 deaths and 1,000,001 strikes us as negligible. And this is certainly rather, I think, poignant and pertinent with what's happening in today's world, where certainly health, safety, well-being, illnesses are in the news everywhere, and there are many people who are worried about the single life of another, whether it be a parent, a grandparent, a child, sibling, close friend, if not family member. And, should something happen to that individual that is close to us, it could certainly have a long-lasting and damaging impact. But yet on the news, we constantly see numbers going up and up and up. As I'm saying this, PA is now, over 4,000 cases of the coronavirus. The United States, I think I saw this morning, up around 135, 140,000. And at some point, that number just becomes too large for our brain to kind of comprehend. And the difference between 140 and 142,000, we might not think it's all that much with it only being 2,000. But if it's in a situation with people that we know or within a number that we can kind of understand and comprehend, it can certainly strike us with a little bit more intensity. Second paragraph. The moral meaning of death counts is further obscured by their apparent lack of objectivity. Take the war in Iraq. And again, please keep in mind that this is from 2006, so this would be part of the U.S. invasion with Iraq. How many Iraqi civilians have died as a consequence of the American invasion? Supporters of the war say 30,000, a number that even President Bush, and this would be the younger Bush, finally brought himself to utter late last year. Opponents of the war say more than 100,000. Surely there must be a fact of the matter. In practice, though, there are only competing methodologies and assumptions, all of which yield different numbers. Even if we could put politics aside and agree on one, it would be hard to say what it meant. Does it matter, for instance, that the higher estimate of 100,000 is the same order of magnitude as the number of Iraqi Kurds that Saddam Hussein is reckoned to have killed in 1987 and 1988 in a genocidal campaign that it has been claimed justified his forcible removal? So is the fact that the possibility exists that 100,000 victims have taken place of an American invasion in part due to a genocide that took place over 20 years earlier, where that same number of people were killed? Does it now, the fact that you have an equality existing between those numbers, take away the justification of such an invasion? Or is it that we know that there were 100,000 from 87 and 88, and certainly more could continue to happen if there was not that invasion taking place? Again, there is no right or wrong answer. It is simply identifying, more of a methodology. How do you kind of justify something as being good, and what is the weight of life? What is that moral weight that exists within the loss of human life when it comes to conflicts? It is painful to contemplate that despite our technologies of assurance and mathematics of certainty, such a fundamental index of reality as numbers of the dead is a nightmarish muddle, wrote Gil Elliot in his 1972 volume, The 20th Century Book of the Dead. Figuring out the number of man-caused deaths is rarely as straightforward as counting skulls in a mass grave. You can kill people with bombs, guns, and machetes, but there are also more indirect ways, causing them to die of starvation, say, or of exposure or disease. The disease need not be indirect. Witness the radiation victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Of the nearly 2 million Cambodians killed by the Khmer Rouge, for instance, perhaps half were executed outright. By contrast, in the ongoing civil war in the Congo, the deadliest conflict since World War II, 2% of the estimated 3.9 million victims have died of direct violence. The rest perished when their substance-level lives were disrupted by the war. This ongoing civil war in the Congo, the deadliest conflict since World War II, 3.9 million victims. I make note of this only because it is very rarely, if ever, a conflict that gets mentioned, by American high school students, let alone American high school, adults or experts. But, I think it kind of emphasizes not our necessarily ignorance of what goes on in the world, but there are so many events, so many conflicts, so many tragedies, that if there is not a direct U.S. connection to it, we tend not to be aware of it. So I think that is something to take note of. Quantifying man-made deaths thus means, at the very least, having an idea of the rate at which people die naturally, and that entails record-keeping. In 17th century Europe, registers kept by church parishes, dates of baptism, marriages, and burials, made it possible to gauge the devastation caused by the 30 Years' War, which was deadlier for civilians than for soldiers. The last century, strange to say, has not always matched this level of demographic sophistication. Even in the case of Nazi Germany, supposedly a model of efficiency, the implementation of the final solution was so chaotic that the number of victims can be known only to the nearest million. And this strikes me, as being incredible, that when it comes to the Holocaust, during World War II, we know, you'll hear numbers of 6 to 7 million Jews, somewhere in the ballpark of 12 to 13 million victims, not within World War II, but just within the Holocaust, perished, lost their lives. And to say that we know, it's somewhere between 12 and 13 million, to me, is astounding, because there's a million people there, a million lives, a million individuals that we can't necessarily identify for sure how many perished. Those of you that have been to the Holocaust Museum, in Washington D.C., one of the images I think that resonates with people and stays with them is a picture of the shoes, from I don't remember if it was Auschwitz or Buchenwald, but one of the concentration camps where the number of names that you see, or the the bodies that will be in a mass grave. Certainly, it means something, but it's hard, I think, for that picture to kind of resonate. But when you see all of the shoes that were piled up from the victims, you start to kind of imagine the person that would be in those shoes, whether it be a child, a mother, siblings, or whatnot. And that's where there's an emotional attachment that really can kind of pull at the heartstrings, where I think we start to recognize the significance of human life. If our methodology of counting man-made deaths is crude, our moral calculus for weighing the resulting numbers is even cruder. Quantification, it is often thought, confers precision and objectivity, yet it tells us very little about comparative evil. We feel that Hitler was every bit as evil as Stalin, even though Stalin was far more successful in murdering people, in part because he had a longer run. Mao may have been more successful still. In the recent book Mao and the Unknown Story, Young Chang and John Holliday estimate that the Chinese leader was responsible for well over 70 million deaths, which would come to nearly half of the total number of man-made deaths in the 20th century. In relative terms, however, Mao is easily eclipsed by Pol Pot, who directed the killing of more than a quarter of his fellow Cambodians. So, and again, not that necessarily we're trying to identify who are the most evil individuals of all time, but how do we come up with kind of weighing those thoughts when it comes to a discussion as such, or a justification of some kind of military act that has to take place? A lot of times we'll look at the straight numbers. Well, okay, who is responsible for X number of deaths or whatnot? And again, certainly the names of Hitler, Stalin, and Mao mean something to people. But again, I think Pol Pot is one who, we do tend to kind of forget about. While he may not be responsible for the same number of deaths as the 70 million potentially, or with Mao, or the 25 million for Stalin, the 15 million or so for Hitler, the percentage, though, almost like the per capita of the amount of lives that he was responsible for the people in Cambodia is exceptionally high. And so I think this at least kind of calls attention to there's different ways of at least identifying, who may have been most responsible for evil acts. And that's not to say, though, that just because a person killed more people that they could be more evil than someone else, or because they killed less people they are less evil than someone else. But it's certainly something to kind of think about from that number statistic standpoint, because a lot of times that is certainly what is utilized to justify actions that take place on a military level. Paragraph 6 kind of looks at this a little bit more philosophically. Raw death numbers may not be a reliable index of evil, but they still have value as a guide to action. That, at least, is the common sense view. It is also part of the ethical theory known as utilitarianism, which holds that sacrificing X lives to save Y lives is always justified as long as Y is greater than X. This utilitarian principle is often invoked, for example, in defense of President Truman's decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed between 120 and 250,000 Japanese civilians, on the assumption that the death toll would have been worse had the war been prolonged. So it's understood that Truman made a decision that certainly caused the death of many people, not many people, but, astronomical amount, when you're talking about 250,000, but at the same time, did it save more lives by sacrificing? And so if X is less than Y, so X lives save Y, Y is greater than X, then from a utilitarian standpoint, that would be justified. Some people, as we get into the next paragraph with Elizabeth Anscombe, would argue that no, that is not the case, because the X lives still do matter. You can't say one life weighs more than the other. I believe it was Cambridge was awarding Truman an honorary doctorate degree, and Anscombe, who was British, said you can't do that. He is a murderer. She didn't argue that he should be imprisoned, but she basically argued you cannot celebrate the fact that another person ended the lives of so many people, and to simply say that it saved more lives is not a reason to justify the death of someone else. Yet some thinkers, as mentioned, like British philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, have questioned whether, morally speaking, numbers really count. In a choice between saving 5 lives and saving 10, they ask, why should we be duty-bound to act in behalf of the greater number? Because, you say, it would be worse for 10 people to die than for 5 people. They reply, worse for whom? Arithmetic misleads us into thinking that deaths aggregate the way that numbers do, yet in reality there are only individuals suffering. In a dilemma where the deaths of one group of people or another is unavoidable, why should someone have to die merely by reason of being in the smaller group? Which a lot of times when it comes to this, it is solely by chance or luck or unluckiness that a person ends up being in those said groups. This sort of skepticism about the significance of numbers has some perverse consequences. It implies that all atrocities have an equal command on a moral attention, regardless of scale. Yet a refusal to aggregate deaths can be ethically salubrious. It helps us realize that the evil of each additional death is in no way diluted by the number of deaths that may have preceded it. The ongoing bloodbath in Darfur has, all agree, claimed an enormous number of victims. Saying just how many is a methodological nightmare. A ballpark figure is 250,000, but estimates range up to 400,000 and beyond. Quantitatively, the new deaths that each day brings us are absorbed into this vast, indeterminate number. Morally, they ought to be as urgent as those on the first day of the slaughter. And as we said, when it comes to a timeline of events, a lot of times more emphasis is placed on those who die early, and not necessarily those who die later, because we become, fairly used to it. You think about World War II, for example, and again, obviously, when you're dealing with nations, patriotic beliefs can certainly kind of cloud the way that we look at things. But when you think of some of the horrors of World War II, obviously, based on sheer numbers, the Holocaust comes to mind. From a U.S. standpoint, I would think Pearl Harbor is one that we tend to think about, because you do have an attack on U.S. soil, and U.S. lives are being lost. But the bombing of Dresden towards the end of the war, not something that was also really made known, communicated to the public at the time that it was happening. And it's not until years later that people become aware of the magnitude of the death of 150, 200, maybe 250,000 people with the bombing of Dresden. Since that's not made known immediately, the significance of those victims really, I think, kind of falls on deaf ears at a time, because it wasn't something that U.S. lives were really a part of, and it wasn't something that we were really aware of, and it was coming towards the close of a war. And so anything that could be done to kind of end World War II, by that time, people were looking at as being a positive. So, this idea certainly would be one to kind of take a look at when it comes to what is part of Holt's overall argument. They ought to be as urgent as those on the first day of the slaughter. The value of human life is not something that gets lost just because the number is getting larger and larger, and the point in which that death takes place is later and later. All right, so that is our article, Math Murders. As I said, you're going to run through and complete this analysis. You can certainly write on the PDF as I am doing. If you want to type in answers to that would be acceptable. You could also print this out, and if you wanted to take a picture, of your handout and resubmit that through Google Classroom, that would be fine. But regardless of how you do this, you are simply going to reattach your copy of Math Murders into Google Classroom into this assignment, and then I'll be able to go through and give you points. The only part that I'm worried about is going to be this analysis part here for pages 3 and 4. I'm not going through and looking for specific things to be highlighted in order for you to receive credit, but certainly I think it would make sense to go through and highlight some things as you're trying to find examples of those persuasive strategies in your 4 sections. So make sure you do have a paragraph numbers, you have rhetorical purpose for each one of those sections, you have persuasive strategies. People, always are going to ask, well, how many strategies do I need? I would think we would be taking a look at a minimum of at least 3 for every section, and then with examples, and then here at the end, you're going to have your summary of the argument for the passage as a whole. Feel free to contact me should you have any questions or need to go over something in a little bit more detail, but good luck with this, and we'll be moving on with the rest of Slaughterhouse-5 next week. Have a good one.